This conference will now be recorded.
So, in today's session, we will focus on the fundamentals of Odata services. What are the basic terms and terminology used in Odata services that we are going to discuss in today's session? So, as I said, Odata services are mainly for database functionalities. The main purpose of every Odata service is to deal with database functionalities. Like select query, insert, delete, update statements, etc. Odata service can be of any type, but ultimately every Odata service contains database functionalities. And here, Odata services are of three types, like Odata ABAP service, Odata HANA service, Odata external service. So Odata ABAP service we generally use for interaction with SAP ECC backend or CRM, SRM, etc. Odata ABAP service deals with database functionalities for interaction with ECC, CRM, etc. Odata HANA service deals with database functionalities for interaction with SAP HANA based system. And Odata external service deals with database functionalities and interacts with non-SAP systems. External service deals with database functionalities and interacts with non-SAP system. So the point here is all these Odata services ultimately they deal with database functionalities here. It can be Odata ABAP service, Odata HANA service, or Odata external service. The main purpose of these services is to implement and execute database operations. For all these Odata services, the front-end development approach remains same. You can use any Odata service in the backend, but the front-end development approach remains same. Front-end is not going to change. Whatever we are going to discuss in the front-end development, that is common and applicable for all types of Odata services. That is, the front-end applications. The front-end applications will consume Odata services for database interaction. The front-end applications deals with screens. Front-end applications deals with screens, or I can say view designing. front-end apps mainly contains screens. They are nothing but views. In UI5 theory, in the front end, we call them as screens, but technically they are nothing but views. So the front-end approach for all these Odata services remains same, because in the front end, ultimately we develop the screens with screen elements. So you can use a table in the front end, you can use a drop down in the front end, checkbox, you can use chart, list, microchart, etc. etc. So you can use any screen element in the front end, but the Odata services can be of any type, irrespective of the Odata ABAP service or HANA service or Excel service. The front end table creation is same, the front end drop down creation is same, the front end checkbox, chart, list, microchart. So the coding for all these screen elements are same irrespective of the backend service. So backend service can be ABAP service or HANA service or Excel service, but the way we develop the screens, the way we write the code for screen elements, that remains same. So the point here is, here you can see there will be database tables. So under database, what we find is, we find several database tables, like for example table 1, table 2, table 3, etc. And each table contains some collection of records here. There can be several database tables and it contains collection of records. So the point here is, from database table, from one or many tables, we can fetch the data. From one or many database tables, we can fetch the data by using Odata service. We can use SAP NetWeaver Gateway. We can develop Odata service. And ultimately, as I said, Odata service is for database operation. So here, we write our select query and we bring the data to an entity set. Ultimately, the data from database tables, from the backend, it will reach entity set. So the point here is, entity set holds collection of records at runtime. Entity set is ultimately to hold collection of records at runtime. The records can come from one or many tables. The data can come from one or many tables, it doesn't matter, but ultimately it contains records. For example, record 1, 2, 3, etc. Let me just use this for diagrammatical purpose. And not only that, at Odata level, there is one more option, that is entity type. At Odata level, there is one more option, that is entity type. Entity type maintains collection of fields. So the data data whichever you bring into entity set, the data will be available with respect to the fields. And the fields are technically available under entity type. In entity type, we maintain the collection of fields, and in entity set at runtime, we gather the data, or we place the data here through select query. So the point here is entity set is important now at this level. So the data comes from database tables to entity set when you are fetching the data. When select query is executed, ultimately the data comes from database tables to an entity set here. The data from database tables will reach entity set when you execute Odata service with a select query. So, now, what frontend has to do? The frontend can be any application here. It can be a UI5 app, or the frontend can be SAP Fiori frontend, or the frontend can be a .NET PHP application. So the frontend application can be UI5, the frontend can be Fiori, the frontend can be .NET PHP application. But the main point here is the data is collected by the frontend always from entity set. The frontend always collects the data from an entity set at runtime. And data can be displayed in the frontend by using screen elements like it can be table, it can be list, chart, microchart, combo box, etc., etc. So the data is always projected in the front end by using various screen elements here. So the data is collected from entity set and the data is displayed in front-end application by using screen elements. So data is collected from here because at runtime entity set holds collection of records, and those records we can display in different screen elements like table, list, chart, etc. Not only that, the entity set of Odata service can send the data to something like a Fiori application here. It can send the data to a Fiori app, and in Fiori also we display the data using screen elements. It can be table, list, chart, microchart, etc. Combo box. So ultimately the data comes to Fiori frontend and the data is displayed in the Fiori screen elements, but the data is ultimately collected from this entity set. When Odata service is executed, we collect the data from entity set. Similarly, there can be non-SAP application like .NET and PHP. There can be a non-SAP application like .NET PHP, but ultimately they also use screen elements. maybe table, maybe list, maybe drop down, or it can be combo box, etc., etc. So non-SAP front-end apps like .NET, PHP applications can also project the data using screen elements by collecting data from this entity set here. So the point here is the front-end can be UI5, the front-end can be Fiori, the front-end can be .NET PHP, but ultimately data is collected from Odata service with entity set. And entity set will fetch the data from one or many database tables on executing select query. Let me just repeat this conclusion point. So the front end can be UI5, the front end can be Fiori, or the front end can be .NET PHP application. Ultimately, they collect data from Odata service entity set here. And entity set will collect data from one or many database tables on executing select query. So this is a general basic data flow from backend to the front end via Odata service. Let me just write some important notes here. Every Odata service project contains mainly 4 folders here. Odata service project contains mainly 4 folders, that is data model, then service implementation, then runtime artifacts, and service maintenance. So these are the 4 folders available for every Odata service project. So what we are going to do is we develop our Odata service projects using SEGW transaction code. We are going to develop Odata service projects using SEGW transaction code with SAP NetWeaver gateway component with ECC. We are going to develop our Odata service projects using SEGWT code under NetWeaver gateway component, which is connected with ECC. Okay, but let us understand these 4 important folders here. What it contains, what is the purpose of each folder? Let us understand these things. So let me go with first data model. So under data model, I can say data model contains something like entity type. Data model contains entity type, and data model contains entity. Data model contains entity set. Data model contains association and association set. So these are the 5 important options of data model section. Every data model section generally contains these 5 important things: entity type, entity, entity set, association set. So let us understand in detail each and every option here. Let me save this. Now let me go to data model. Let us understand all these 5 options with a diagram. So generally in Odata service development, we try to make use of something like entity type. We make use of entity type, and this entity type generally contains collection of fields. For example, user ID, first name, last name, country, salary, etc. So you can maintain collection of fields under entity type inside data model, and each field contains data type as well as length. Each field internally contains data type as well as length. So in simple words, I can say entity type is an option to maintain collection of fields. The main purpose of entity type is ultimately to maintain collection of fields. But this option is something similar to entity type is an option, and this is something similar to a structure in normal ABAP. If you compare this with normal ABAP, then this entity type is something similar to structure in normal ABAP terminology. So instead of creating structures in Odata, we try to create entity types. You can have n number of structures. That means you can have n number of entity types inside a project in Odata. But each entity type ultimately contains collection of fields. So entity type is an option to maintain collection of fields with data type and length. Entity type is an option to maintain collection of fields, and each field has a data type and length. Entity type is similar to structure under normal ABAP. If you want to compare, you can compare entity type with a structure in normal ABAP. But at Odata level, we use entity type as a keyword. Now, what about entity here? So, what we can do is we can make use of these fields. We can make use of these fields here, and we can hold a single